So I'm going to kick it off to Joe, and he's going to go ahead and introduce Tony Pecinovsky.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Good evening, comrades, students, activists. My name is Joe Henry. I'm a local community activist, also a party member since 1982. The Communist Party has been part of Iowa for decades, going back to 1947 when a community activist, Edna Griffin, civil rights activist, demanded to be seated in Cat's drugstore downtown. There's a building downtown called the Edna Griffin Building, and then there's a bridge downtown too called the Edna Griffin Bridge. And Edna was a communist. And if you Google her, you'll find out more about Edna. Edna was the person who got me involved in the party in 1982 when I was your age. So this is going to be a great event. Our party is over 100 years old now, about 101 years. September. So we're probably the oldest. We were the biggest back then. We were close to about 1 million members. Not quite. 100,000. Okay. But it's great to be here with Tony Pecinovsky. Comes from St. Louis, a party member who wrote this book down here. Tony also ran for city council down in St. Louis last year. Almost won, he had 54 more votes. What you're going to hear from Tony is a great history of social justice movements, civil rights movements, how things were built in this country to fight the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and how we're all fighting for freedom and justice here in the USA. So I'm going to introduce Tony. Tony, come on up.
So before I jump into my presentation, just really quickly, 2 things about the book that I want everybody to know. First, the book was written to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Communist Party in 1919. So it has been 100 years. This September of 2020 will be nearing the 101st birthday or anniversary. The second reason why I wrote the book was because I wanted to challenge the dominant narrative within U.S. historiography that argues that the Communist Party became a marginal political force post-1956. In most histories of the Communist Party, 1956 is where things end. We hear about the heyday in the 1930s, we hear about the work of communists during World War II, we hear about the McCarthy era, and then things just end in 1956 as if the Communist Party ceased to exist. And so my book is written as part of a challenge to that historical narrative, and I try to move the narrative forward into the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, and even into the 2000s, as the chapter on Judith LeBlanc demonstrates. There are copies of the book over there. Please see me afterwards. I think Travis is going to have them for sale and everything. So, with that as an introduction, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my presentation. It is about 30 minutes long, so I hope that's okay with everybody. It has been 22 years since I've been in college, so I'm not sure how things are done nowadays. Anyways, it was early February 1963. Gus Hall, General Secretary of the Communist Party, USA, sat patiently as more than 1,000 students from the University of Virginia packed Cabell Auditorium. Students came in droves, it was reported, which forced a smile from the steelworker turned union organizer turned CPUSA leader. The auditorium was already at capacity when an additional 1,000 students were turned away. The overflow crowd was proof, according to Hall, that the probing minds of youth know no political boundaries, that they would not acquiesce to anti-communism. Hall viewed their eagerness to learn about Marxism-Leninism as a reassertion, a commitment to defend your right to hear whomsoever you choose, thereby challenging the McCarran Act and the House Un-American Activities Committee, and helping to spur what would become known as the Student Free Speech Movement, a movement partly led by communists. Later that month, Hall spoke at Yale. "I'm the real article," he told the assembled 500 students, "not a caricature, not a Cold War boogeyman." Hall playfully brought Yale's political skeleton out of the socialist closet, informing the assembled students that another longtime CPUSA leader, Alexander Treckenberg, was in his youth the chairman of the Yale Society for the Study of Socialism. Hall challenged the assertion that there was no freedom of expression in the Soviet Union, a popular theme among Cold Warriors. He added, "I won't slander the Soviet Union to win my place and my right to fight for socialism here." Hall's perspective on the same sacred freedom in the United States had been soured. After all, he had spent most of the 1950s in hiding or in jail due to his political beliefs. Maybe the fact that I served 6 years in jail for thinking makes me a little prejudiced. Or perhaps I am prejudiced because I face a possible 30 years in prison under the McCarran Act. Adding injury to insult, Hall noted that he had to get permission to travel and personally appear before his HUAC inquisitors. Just days before the engagement, Senator Thomas Dodd unsuccessfully attempted to force Yale to cancel the event and thereby deny Hall his First Amendment rights. The irony was certainly not lost on the assembled Hanson bands. They responded with appreciative laughter when Hall joked that Senator Dodd will sleep well, knowing that his appearance did not constitute a clear and present danger to national security. The irony thickened 4 years later when Dodd was censured by his Senate colleagues for improprieties in his financial affairs. Apparently, the New England lawyer had diverted to his own personal use over $116,000 in campaign contributions. Hall was probably tickled by the news. By mid-March, Hall spoke at the biggest meeting of the year on a campus of 1,200, as more than 1/3 of the student body fills Schwartz Hall on the Brandeis campus. The visit, sponsored by the Student Political Education and Action Committee, was a huge success. Every seat was taken and the doors were closed a half hour before Hall's appearance. Arnold Johnson, the General Secretary's friend and comrade, reported more people were turned away than were able to get in. Hall's early 1963 East Coast speaking engagement wasn't an aberration. Communists were speaking on college and university campuses in front of large and enthusiastic audiences all across the country. Marxist historian Herbert Aptheker addressed 250 students at Michigan State University in January. That March, he spoke with 400 students at the University of Michigan, 1,200 students at Howard University, and 125 students at Roosevelt University. In June, Aptheker spoke to a packed hall at Bard College, and that December, he also spoke at Harvard. Benjamin Davis Jr., the one-time Harlem communist councilman, addressed 500 students at Brown University in February. He told curious students, "I joined the Communist Party as a result of my experience as a Negro. I was looking for freedom and first-class citizenship." He emphasized that his communist beliefs were made in the USA. That fall, Davis spoke to about 100 students at City College, New York. He proclaimed, "We live in an epoch of transition of capitalism to socialism. That transition included the struggle of Negro Americans to pass from a status of indignity and second-class citizenship to first-class citizenship and dignity." He called this movement towards dignity a social revolution, although not a socialist revolution. It is a revolution designed to overthrow the Jim Crow system, not necessarily capitalism. A revolution to enforce our democracy against the Dixiecrats and the ultra-right. He told students, "Anti-communism is a smokescreen. The real aim is to destroy the Bill of Rights." I'm going to repeat that. Anti-communism is a smokescreen. The real aim is to destroy the Bill of Rights. During this trip, Hall also held a press conference at the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union. ILWU President Harry Bridges was known for his close ties to communists. Hall also spoke at Stanford University in front of 1,500 students, while his comrade Arnold Johnson jammed the 700-person capacity auditorium at Hamilton College. According to the Utica Daily Press, there were people sitting in the organ loft and on the stairs, the floor and window ledges to hear the party stalwarts. Also in February, 350 students heard Bart at Bodine College in Maine, and hundreds more heard Apted in St. Paul, Minnesota. Apted also addressed 250 students at the University of Pennsylvania in April, while Benjamin Davis Jr. addressed 600 at Harvard. African American Party leader James Jackson addressed 1,400 students at Colby College in May, and it was reported in March 1962 that Hall gave 37 separate speeches in just 12 days. In April, he told 400 students at CCNY that if the McCarran Act prosecutors succeed in jailing him and Benjamin Davis Jr., no American will be free. Fortunately, the political winds were shifting, he concluded. Nearly 1,000 students at Swarthmore College agreed as they turned out for Hall on April 29. On May 1st, Hall addressed 7,000 people at the Union Square May Day rally in New York. Days later, he spoke with 400 students at Hunter College, 700 students at the University of Chicago, and 1,800 more at the University of Wisconsin, where an additional 1,500 students were turned away due to a lack of seating. By mid-June 1962, Hall would declare, "During the past 6 months, I have spoken to some 50,000 students and youth directly. The tide has turned." The tide he's referencing is McCarthyism. Communist speaking engagements continued unabated into the fall. Hall continued. In the mass movements, the most important and most active contingent are the youth. Jubilantly, he added, student demand to hear communist was completely without precedent. It is of such magnitude that no force is able to ignore it, including the FBI. It has become a point of discussion on all levels of political life, he added. We are so close to it that we do not fully appreciate it. Hall called the growing demand for communist speakers a mass breakout from the conformist straitjacket of McCarthyism, a rejection of anti-communism, a bewildering defeat for the ruling class. Though many of the emerging student groups were loose and even temporary in nature, Hall was still optimistic. He saw the potential for a spark that can fundamentally change and challenge the contours of U.S. anti-communism, a spark spearheaded by youth. Additionally, he noted the array of self-published journals students were then printing. Isn't it fantastic that in a number of colleges, there are 2, 3, or 4 monthly magazines and newspapers, he said, many with a Marxist outlook. That communists must be a factor in finding forms through which this tremendous energy can best express itself was a given. That we must be more than mere observers was also a given. Hall's perspective that communists must be a force in helping to initiate forms of united action in this upsurge and help give it cohesion and direction wasn't just rhetorical. Soon, party-led formations like the Advanced Youth Organization, the Progressive Youth Organizing Committee, and later, the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs would emerge. Are you all familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois? Joined the Communist Party in 1961? Just wanted to know that. Okay. The substance of Hall's campus presentations often focused on free speech, democracy, and the defeat of the ultra-right. Speaking to students in New York, he hailed freedom of speech as vital. It is a weapon, he added, It must be preserved if we hope to collectively thrash out the very complicated problems youth face. He connected the fight for free speech generally to the fight to hear communists specifically. There's a very deep feeling that if you can preserve the right of communists to speak, then you can preserve the right of all to speak, he said. That's true. But it's more than just a fight for the right of communists to speak. The fact is, they, youth and students, want to hear a communist speak. They are sick and tired of hearing the so-called communist viewpoint from anti-communists, he concluded. To him, a shift in consciousness was taking place. The fascist-like assault designed to transform the American people into a hysterical anti-communist mob had failed. Senator Joseph McCarthy had been silenced. The Smith and McCarran Acts would both be declared unconstitutional, and communists were now on the offensive, regularly speaking to thousands of students across the country and playing an important role in the emerging civil rights and peace movements. The squirming of politicians, the fanatical fascist-like fringe of the ultra-right was being pushed back into its lair, Paul concluded. And this was partly due to the courage of student activists who spearheaded the right of communists to speak on college and university campuses across the country, a strategic relationship Paul would not soon forget, and one that would become a prominent feature of the General Secretary's work for many years to come. Foreshadowing years of successful college speaking tours, in a June 1961 television interview, Paul blasted HUAC thought police. He told reporters, "The attempt to jail ideas cannot succeed. Thought cannot be outlawed." Thought cannot be outlawed. The party, he continued, will struggle for every breath of legality. That fall, Paul was speaking at Cornell University in front of nearly 2,000 students as an additional 2,000 were turned away. This years-long struggle for legality partly explains Paul's willingness to traverse the country, to speak at college and university campuses, and to act as a conduit by which student radicalism could express itself. Students challenged campus faculty, administration, and right-wing community leaders by defiantly inviting communists to speak. Paul and other CPUSA leaders discussed Marxism-Leninism, peace, workers' rights, and the struggle for African-American equality with students. Young communists aided campus organizing. This was a free speech movement, a broad-based, multi-class assault on censorship, of which communists were no small part. While protest tactics received more attention, student resistance took many forms, and communists often urged students to take a more active role in campus administration, which obviously did not carry favor among campus administrators. They also encouraged students to, lost my space. Sorry about that. They also encouraged students to conduct polls to challenge McCarran Act thought control, which many were inclined to do. Paul certainly asserted in fall 1965 that the left, including the CPUSA, can best exert its influence if it is united around methods broadly and not bogged down in sectarianism. On this basis, we are working with and are a part of most of the movements and struggles of the people, including the student upsurge. This was an understatement of sorts, as historian Gerald Horne points out. The party played a major role in igniting these student protests, insofar as the initial grievance of students was the effort to bar them from hearing Reds on campuses. That many of these same students became young communists served to bolster a strategic relationship that ultimately proved fertile ground from which the party would attempt to rebuild its hounded and depleted ranks. Even non-communists acknowledged the CPUSA's growth among youth. James H. Forrest, National Secretary of the Catholic Peace Fellowship, in 1966 told reporters, "Students see the CPUSA as a moderate, well-established, well-known left-wing organization, not an ultra-left group aligned with violence." In short, the party's appeal to youth and students was not surprising. This sentiment was shared by others, including J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI director tacitly acknowledged the impact Reds were having on college and university campuses and ordered his underlings to continue to keep tabs on communists and their student allies. Cartha D. DeLoach, assistant director to the FBI, speaking at an American Bar Association conference in January 1962, told reporters, "Communists have grown increasingly ambitious in their designs upon youth." He pointed to the Progressive Youth Organizing Committee and said it was created to pave the way for greater communist influence among broad segments of our college students. He also credited Hall with the party's renewed emphasis on youth. By May 1962, Time would report that some 100 campuses had extended invitations to communist speakers. It did not, however, report on the number of colleges and universities that had denied Hall and other communists their First Amendment right, which was also likely a considerable number. That same month, Arnold Johnson spoke to an audience of 800 at Washington University in St. Louis, my hometown. He spoke to 700 at Hamilton College, as I mentioned before, and in December he spoke to 450 students at Trinity College. Hall told 1,000 students at Swarthmore that anti-communism has become a big business, a profession which is a racket, a smokescreen behind which all kinds of crimes are committed against the American people. He likened anti-communism to a weapon, a studied club, a political poison, the horrific basis of Hitler's brutality, the cornerstone of his gas chambers and concentration camps. That September, the party's Lecture and Information Bureau sent a series of letters to various professors, college papers, student councils, and organizations requesting that you invite representatives of the Communist Party to speak. This was a deliberate, systematic approach to reach students. In the past year, communist spokesmen addressed more than 30 colleges and universities where approximately 75,000 students and townspeople attended. It is clear from this, the letter concluded, that students wish to hear the communist viewpoint from bona fide spokesmen. Students in their search for knowledge apparently are not satisfied to learn about communism from anti-communists. Paul increasingly framed the Cold War as a struggle between life and death. He attacked Cold War policies at home and abroad as undemocratic and even suicidal. He called the policies that sacrifice the interest of the people and the nation to those of a few monopolies a foundational concept of Cold War politics. That the Cold War is self-defeating was obvious, he told students. To Hall, these policies were of a bankrupt and dead-end character. They were suicidal policies of the ultra-right, designed to propel our nation down a totally reckless path towards nuclear war. Hall said anti-communism has truly become a big business as weapons manufacturers were living high off the government hog due to increased military spending. Ominously, Hall added, the Cold War was political lunacy combined with nuclear power, an unthinkable danger to all mankind, especially youth and students who would bear the brunt of the new war. Fortunately, this same demographic was flocking to campus auditoriums and stadiums by the thousands to hear what communists had to say. Al Richmond of the West Coast People's World echoed Hall. He said, the Cold War is the malignant core of the social status quo. It is a cancerous growth then being excised by youth and student activists, communists among them. Daniel Rubin, who spoke on about 40 campuses in the early 1960s, boasted in fall 1962 that the PYOC, the Progressive Youth Organizing Committee, had grown. Its growth suggested that many students considered the CP a legitimate and necessary participant in the great debate on communism in our country. To Rubin, communists were taking a number of steps to increase their influence among youth. The party's support for the PYOC, the numerous college speaking engagements, and the considerable mobilization for the 8th World Festival of Youth and Students in Helsinki was his proof. In August 1962, Rubin and other communists also attended the annual Congress of the National Student Association, which was the largest student group in the country at the time and would later merge with other student groups to become the United States Student Association, which is still today the largest student group in the country. Which had earlier partnered with the Advanced Youth Organizing Committee to fight against the McCarran Act. Young communists like Angela Davis and Bettina Apthotker were members of the party-led formation, and over 1,000 students attended the conference where young communists found common ground with moderate student association members like the future Congressman Barney Frank, who argued that the McCarran Act is an abomination, and I am against abominations, it should be repealed. Rubin, Paul, and other communists were far from satisfied, though. They saw that improving drastically the size and quality of the communist youth is essential for influencing the mass democratic youth movement in a progressive direction. The party needed to do more, they argued. Paul and Rubin emphasized the creation of an extraordinary organizational form, a communist youth division designed to give proper emphasis, push, and scope to youth activity. Coupled with their successful university and college speaking engagements, communists also experimented with new and even spontaneous forms of youth organization. That Hall was indicted in March 1962 added to his and the party's sense of urgency. To him, the ruling class was once again acting out of desperation, which wasn't lost on youth and students. Yes, Paul was a victim of a police state law, a fascist enabling act, a monstrous law and cowardly capitulation to right-wing extremism. The FBI, as well as uniformed and undercover police, watched his every move. For example, the New York Times reported that 22 uniformed police and 15 detectives attended an early May Hunter College speaking engagement that Hall had spoke at. Paul and the party were defiant, though, as the continuing lunacy was in the process of birthing its antithesis, an upsurge led by youth and students powerful enough to win the decisive case for democracy in our land. Communists had confidence in the American people, especially youth. This was undeniable. However, victory against fascism took convincing. The CPUSA believed that the Bill of Rights can and must be the effective law of our democracy. This belief, along with the tens of thousands of students then clamoring to hear CPUSA speakers, gave Hall and his comrades the confidence to muster on. In fall 1963, Herbert Apthotker, considered by some the most dangerous communist in the United States, spoke at Los Angeles State College, the University of California, San Jose State College, Oakland City College, San Francisco State College, the University of California, Berkeley, the University of the Pacific, and the University of Oregon. As Apthotker put it, audiences were not only large, this is not new, they were genuinely interested. Anti-communism as an intellectual weapon is losing its effectiveness, he said. Paul agreed. He urged his comrades to see the upsurge as an opportunity to put our house in order, with an emphasis on party building among youth. Self-critically, he told his comrades that the party needed to correct the damage done in the 1950s through excesses in the name of security, and take a fresh look at the problems and tasks of party building. We must find a way, in spite of and in defiance of harassment, to build the party and the press and to increase our public activity. Though the party's public activity was at a high level, recruitment lagged. The political needs of today make a breakthrough a real possibility. We must guarantee it, Paul said. We had to fight to break the isolation of our party after years of concerted political repression, and we still need to do so, he continued. Paul was not willing to let the party rest on recent successes. The task ahead is a big one. We need simultaneously to mobilize the party and to strengthen ourselves organizationally, politically, and ideologically. And we must do this while doing ever more in the field of mass work. Paul called for a 3 or 4 month intensive period of party renewal, a period of rejuvenation, refreshment, and revitalization. We must get with these historic times and make history, he added, which required more alertness, more boldness, more determination, a task communists seemed ready to take on. James E. Jackson, in his fall 1963 letter to Henry Winston, was exuberant. He shared Hall's and Aptheker's optimistic outlook. Like his comrades, he saw the party's work among youth as essential and noted that by early in 1964, there will be born a real union of youth for socialism, the W.E.B. Du Bois Clubs, an organization with an explicit banner, program, and leadership, Jackson added, that will carry forward in present times and circumstances the work of comrades like Henry Winston, Gil Green, and Claude Lightfoot, communists who gave leadership to the youth and student movement in the pre-war years. It is gratifying to witness how people are emerging from the long night of McCarthyism, Jackson continued. The recent wave of successful speaking engagements, as well as the 1963 March on Washington, was fresh in his mind. Dawn had brought with it tens of thousands of youth activists, now packed into university stadiums fighting for the right to hear communists speak. Daniel Rubin would note in retrospect that the forming of the Du Bois Clubs was designed to attract young people to the party, and it did to some extent. DBC National Chair Philip Davis articulated the youth organization's main goal: to become a potent force on the American political scene. Spur, the DBC's newsletter, noted that the new organization was born to fill a gap felt to exist by many young people who have been involved in the movements for peace, civil rights, and economic security for the American people. Youth across this country agreed that an organization was needed which would stand for the goals of all these democratic movements and, at the same time, go beyond them to point the way towards a socialist society. The newsletter's editors urged youth and students to break out of the overstuffed armchair socialism which has become so comfortable for us. They criticized the fireside discussion groups which analyze and reanalyze the movement, a searching of the line with which to guide the movement, and of the proper book with which to establish our authority, as if worshiping the printed word was an end in itself. The newsletter also highlighted the work of DBC chapters across the country, including the organizing of vigils in honor of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, civil rights activists who had been murdered in Mississippi that spring. That Schwerner was a red diaper baby, his parents were New York Party members, brought the horrific murder too close to home for many